The air was dry, carrying the dust of Coffeyville as though the earth itself had held its breath. A crowd had gathered, their boots scuffing the dirt into a restless haze, their whispers sharpening into the kind of silence that presses against the skin. All eyes were fixed on the crude wooden frame, its beams groaning under the weight of fate. The Dalton brothers stood there, shoulders pulled taut, their faces carved by defiance, and the hollow resignation of men who had gambled everything and lost. A rope dangled for each, rough and frayed, its fibers catching the sunlight like strands of pale fire. The townspeople shifted uneasily, caught between vengeance and awe. Mothers clutched their children close, teaching them with their silence what justice looked like in the West. Old men spat tobacco into the dirt, their eyes locked on the outlaws they had once cursed under their breath in saloons and on porches. A few, though, could not deny the pull of tragedy. The spectacle of men who had lived as legends, about to fall into myth. The Dalton brothers' breaths were visible in the morning chill, sharp clouds that vanished as quickly as they rose. Every inhale was a countdown, every exhale a farewell. The rope swung lightly in the breeze, its creak against the beam echoing louder than gunfire ever had. The smell of sweat, leather, and raw hemp thickened the air. Above them, a sky wide and merciless stared down, indifferent to the scene about to unfold. There, in that final moment, the West itself seemed to pause, caught between the law that demanded blood and the legend that would rise from it. For the Dalton Gang, this was no longer a story of robbery or rebellion. It was the silence before the drop, the heartbeat before memory became history. The story of the Dalton Gang has been told 1,000 different ways, each version polished to suit the teller's needs. To some, they were nothing but cutthroats, bandits who brought death and chaos to the towns they touched. To others, they were folk heroes, men who spat in the face of power and lived free in a land that tried to cage them. Between the church steps and the saloon tables, between wanted posters nailed to wooden walls and whispered tales around campfires, the Daltons became larger than their flesh and blood. The myth was simple, seductive. Brothers bound by blood, daring enough to take from the banks that chained common men, bold enough to ride where lawmen feared to follow. They were cast as rebels against order, figures who had traded salvation for infamy. In the saloons of Dodge and Wichita, their names were spoken with the same mixture of fear and admiration once reserved for Jesse James or Billy the Kid. When a man ordered whiskey and muttered the Daltons, eyes turned, ears leaned in. The legend of outlawry was afire, and the Dalton brothers fed it well. But myths are dangerous things. They strip away the grime and sweat, the stench of horses left unwashed, the stink of fear that clings to a man after a botched robbery. They erase the faces of the widows left behind, the trembling of shopkeepers with rifles pressed to their chests, the children who learned early that even the bravest sheriff could not always protect them. To the people of Coffeyville, the Dalton brothers were not the noble rebels sung about in cheap dime novels. They were shadows at the edge of town, men who could turn laughter into panic with the sound of spurred boots at a doorway. The myth they sold you was that these men were untouchable, that their blood bond and their ruthless cunning placed them beyond the reach of ordinary justice. But myths have a way of unraveling when they are dragged into the daylight, and in the dust of Kansas, the Dalton Gang would discover that legends are fragile things. All it takes is one morning, one crowd, one rope to strip a myth bare and show the trembling mortal bodies beneath. The story of the Dalton Gang begins not in the gallows of Coffeyville, but in the rolling dust of Indian Territory, in the homespun struggle of a family caught between poverty and ambition. The Dalton brothers, Grat, Bob, Emmett, and Bill, were not born into legend. They were born into hunger, into the restless drift of the American frontier where survival often demanded more than the law could offer. Their father, Lewis Dalton, was a man hardened by the soil and his failures upon it. Their mother, Adeline, carried the burden of raising 13 children in a house where food was scarce, and the land itself seemed unwilling to give. Out of this crucible, the Dalton boys learned early that strength, cunning, and loyalty to blood were the only currencies worth holding. At first, the Daltons did not look like outlaws. In fact, they wore the badge. Several of the brothers, including Bob and Grat, rode as deputy marshals in Indian Territory, tasked with chasing fugitives, tracking whiskey runners, and facing the same lawless men they would later resemble. The irony was not lost on those who remembered them. Men who once swore oaths to the law, now swearing oaths only to themselves. But poverty has a way of eroding loyalty, and the sight of gold coins passing hands in saloons while their own pockets remained empty gnawed at them like hunger in the belly. They carried the star on their chests, yes, but behind their eyes the idea of something more dangerous was already forming. The transformation from lawmen to lawbreakers was not a sudden fall, but a slow slide. A horse theft here, a questionable arrest there. Whispers that a Dalton had looked the other way when a whiskey trader pressed silver into his palm. In those days, the West was still wide, and the line between outlaw and officer was thin enough to blur. To ride with a badge meant power. To ride without it meant freedom. And freedom was sweeter. By the early 1890s, Dalton brothers had embraced what the frontier offered, a chance to seize their fate with their own hands, no matter the blood spilled in the process. They began as rustlers, lifting horses under cover of night, driving them across county lines where names faded into dust and stolen property could be sold without question. From there, they turned to the railroads. In those iron tracks, they saw not just steel and steam, but veins of wealth pumping across the land. A train was not simply a machine. It was a moving vault, its cars heavy with money shipments, jewelry, strong boxes filled with payroll. The Daltons' first robberies were clumsy. They struck hard but without precision, relying on fear rather than finesse. Yet each success, no matter how messy, sharpened their craft. They studied the habits of conductors, the rhythms of train schedules, the patterns of guards. They learned how to position themselves along a track where steam slowed to a crawl, where the element of surprise could be wielded like a weapon. With every raid, their confidence grew, and so did their reputation. To ordinary folk, they were phantoms on horseback, slipping into the night with gun barrels flashing and laughter echoing behind them. To the law, they were a spreading infection, a reminder that the frontier's promise of order was still fragile. It was Bob Dalton, the most ambitious of the brothers, who became the heart of the gang. Where Grat was the steady hand and Emmett the loyal shadow, Bob carried the fire. He dreamed not merely of wealth, but of infamy, of carving the Dalton name into the same legend that Jesse James had once occupied. Bob studied the stories of the James brothers, the younger gang, even Billy the Kid. He believed the Daltons could surpass them all, and so he began to orchestrate not just robberies but spectacles. The gang expanded beyond the brothers, drawing in restless men who saw in the Daltons both opportunity and protection. Among them was Bill Doolin, who would later form his own notorious gang, and other hard riders whose names would flicker briefly in wanted posters before fading into obscurity. Together they struck trains in California and Indian Territory, their audacity growing bolder. The newspapers began to print their names, and with each headline their myth thickened. But notoriety is a double-edged blade. The more the Daltons stole, the more the public demanded their capture. Posses formed. Pinkerton detectives tracked their movements. Every town they passed through bristled with suspicion. Yet Bob was undeterred. In fact, he welcomed it. For him, the chase was part of the glory. He wanted the world to know the Dalton name, to whisper it with the same tremor reserved for the Jameses. He wanted to etch himself into history, even if it meant dying in the attempt. Their most infamous gamble came in October of 1892, when Bob conceived of a robbery so audacious it bordered on madness. They would ride into Coffeyville, Kansas, broad daylight, guns flashing, and rob 2 banks at once. It would be their masterpiece, a crime so daring that no one would ever surpass it. The plan glittered in his mind like gold in the sun. If they succeeded, they would vanish into legend. If they failed, well, failure was a word Bob Dalton had long stopped believing in. But as the gang prepared their horses and checked their revolvers, the land itself seemed to turn against them. Rumors spread. The air in Coffeyville thickened with unease, and unseen eyes waited. The Daltons had risen from poverty to power, from lawmen to the very men the law hunted. Their ride had carried them to the edge of myth, but the edge is a dangerous place. One step too far and there is nothing beneath you but the fall. On the morning of October 5th, 1892, the Dalton Gang rode toward Coffeyville, Kansas, with the quiet confidence of men who had long tested fate and never yet been broken by it. The sun had just begun to climb, burning away the mist that clung to the earth, and the sound of horses' hooves carried across the stillness like distant drums. The brothers, Bob, Grat, and Emmett, along with Dick Broadwell and Bill Power, rode into town dressed in long dusters to hide their rifles, their faces hard with resolve. Bob's plan was clear: strike both the C.M. Condon Company Bank and the First National Bank at the same time, overwhelm the townsfolk with shock, and ride away richer than any gang before them. But Coffeyville was no ordinary target. It was a town of shopkeepers and blacksmiths, farmers and store clerks, people who had carved their homes from the Kansas soil with sweat and grit. They were not strangers to violence, nor were they easily cowed. Coffeyville had been tested before by drifters and lawless men, and its people had learned to arm themselves not out of paranoia but necessity. Behind the calm facades of storefronts and the neat rows of wooden houses lay rifles and shotguns, waiting. The first sign of unraveling came as the gang tethered their horses in an alley near the banks. They had hoped to slip into town unnoticed, to blend in just long enough to strike. But the Dalton brothers carried themselves like wolves among sheep, and eyes sharp with suspicion began to follow them. A boy spotted the rifles beneath the dusters. A store clerk whispered to a customer. In a matter of minutes, word spread through Coffeyville like sparks on dry grass. The Daltons are here. Inside the banks, the robbery began with the mechanical precision the gang had rehearsed. Grat and Power stormed into Condon Bank, demanding the teller open the safe. Bob, Emmett, and Broadwell entered First National, revolvers drawn, their voices ringing with authority. The tellers trembled, the managers obeyed, and for a moment it seemed as though the plan might hold. Money was being gathered, sacks filled with bills and coins. Bob's dream, the legend he craved, was within reach. But outside, Coffeyville was already stirring. Merchants closed their shops, farmers rushed from the livery. Within minutes, rifles were pulled from racks, pistols loaded at kitchen tables. The town became a hive of resistance, each man and boy preparing to stand not just for his own safety, but for the town's honor. The people of Coffeyville would not let their banks fall without a fight. As the gang struggled with safes that would not open and clerks who stalled for time, the trap began to close. Windows across the square filled with the dark outlines of armed men. The sheriff, quick to rally his neighbors, called them to positions. From the rooftops to behind barrels and wagons, Coffeyville bristled with gun barrels pointed toward the banks. The gang, unaware of just how fast the tide had turned, continued their work, their voices echoing against marble walls, their bags filling with the weight of stolen wealth. Then the first shot cracked. It came from outside, sharp and defiant, and in an instant the square exploded into chaos. Bullets shattered glass, horses screamed, and the air filled with the bitter stench of gunpowder. The gang's careful plan disintegrated in seconds. What was meant to be their crowning act of defiance had instead become a death trap. Grat cursed under his breath as he realized the safe in Condon Bank was on a time lock. Bob's jaw tightened as he peered out a window, seeing rifles trained on every exit. Emmett's hands trembled as he clutched the money bag, the weight of it suddenly meaningless. Broadwell shifted nervously, his eyes darting from door to door while Power muttered that they should have ridden on, that Coffeyville had never been theirs to take. For the first time, the Dalton brothers felt the cold bite of inevitability. They were not ghosts or legends now. They were trapped men in a town that had already decided their fate. The people they had long believed were helpless were now hunters, and the Dalton Gang, for all its bravado, had stumbled into the jaws of history. The beginning of the end had arrived, not with a lawman's warrant or a Pinkerton's pursuit, but with the will of ordinary people standing together against the outlaws who thought themselves untouchable. The dust of Coffeyville swirled in the chaos, and within it, the Daltons' legend began to crack. The town square of Coffeyville erupted into a battlefield, though no bugle had sounded and no army had marched in. It was a clash born of instinct, of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary defiance. The Dalton Gang, who had ridden in under the weight of legend, now found themselves drowning in the thunder of gunfire and the acrid smoke of gunpowder. Windows shattered in showers of glass, horses reared and screamed as bullets tore the air, and the once still morning transformed into chaos. Inside the banks, the Daltons realized too late the trap they had walked into. Grat cursed under his breath, tugging helplessly at the safe's iron door in Condon Bank. He had been told it could be opened quickly, but the time lock mocked him with its silent refusal. Every second wasted was another second the townsman grew bolder. Across the square, Bob's face burned with rage as he caught sight of rifles glinting in the sunlight from nearly every doorway. His dream of glory had turned in a single instant into a death sentence. The first bullets ripped through the wood of the bank doors, splinters showering the floor. Emmett shouted, his voice tight with panic, as townsmen rushed the square, firing from behind wagons and barrels. The sharp crack of Winchesters mixed with the deeper boom of shotguns. Each shot carried not just lead but a lifetime of resentment, a community's refusal to bow. These were not lawmen. They were storekeepers and farmers, men with rough hands and steady eyes who had lived too long under the shadow of raiders. The Daltons burst from the banks in desperate flight, guns drawn, their horses waiting in the alley. Grat and Power stumbled first into the storm of bullets, their dusters flaring like wings. They fired wildly, their shots carving empty furrows into the air as the townsfolk answered with precision. Power staggered, clutching his chest, and fell against the hitching post, his life draining into the dust. Grat, furious and desperate, raised his revolver, but a rifle cracked from a nearby store and his body folded with the force of the blow. Bob Dalton emerged with fire in his eyes, his revolver spitting sparks. For a brief moment he looked every bit the outlaw he had dreamed of becoming. Fearless, defiant, unyielding. But the myth could not shield him from reality. A volley struck him as he stepped into the open, his body jerking with the impact, his pistol slipping from his grip. He collapsed in the street, the dust rising around him like a shroud. Emmett, younger and less hardened, clung to hope even as the world collapsed. He clutched the heavy sack of stolen money and dashed for the alley, bullets tearing past him. Pain seared through him as lead struck his body again and again, Yet still he staggered forward, driven by something deeper than survival, a refusal to let go of the dream his brothers had built. He reached the horses, nearly crumpling, blood soaking his clothes, but by some dark mercy he remained alive. Unlike his brothers, his story did not end in Coffeyville's dust. Broadwell, caught between loyalty and terror, tried to flee the square, his body twisting as he fired back at the shadows in windows and alleys. His escape was short-lived. A shot caught him in the back, and he fell face first into the dirt, his hands clawing at the earth as though he might bury himself from the storm raining down upon him. The gunfire roared on, deafening and unrelenting, until one by one the gang's voices were silenced. The people of Coffeyville had turned the square into a gallows, each bullet another knot in the rope of justice. By the time the smoke began to clear, the Dalton Gang lay scattered across the street, men who had believed themselves legends now reduced to broken bodies in the dust. The townsfolk emerged slowly, their faces grim and pale. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers for the dead even if they were outlaws. Others spat into the dirt, muttering curses. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, though the memory of that morning would live in them regardless. The once mythic Daltons had been undone not by lawmen, not by marshals or Pinkertons, but by shopkeepers and blacksmiths who refused to be prey. Emmett alone clung to life, riddled with bullets, his breath ragged, his eyes clouded but open. As he lay in the dirt, he saw the faces of his brothers still and lifeless, their dreams of glory bleeding into the soil. He had thought they were immortal, untouchable, bound together by blood and destiny. Now, bound only by failure, he realized the West had no patience for myths that grew too bold. The rope had not been needed, the guns of Coffeyville had done the hanging. By midday, the square was silent again, save for the murmur of the crowd. The bodies of the Dalton brothers and their fallen companions were dragged and laid out for all to see, a spectacle as grim as it was final. Their eyes, once alight with fire, now stared blankly at the sky that had borne witness to their fall. The sun moved overhead, indifferent as ever, washing their stillness in light. The Dalton Gang had dreamed of glory, of surpassing Jesse James, of living forever in the echoes of outlaw legend. Instead, they died in the dust of Coffeyville, their final act not a triumph, but a warning. The West could build myths, but it could also tear them down, and in that square, surrounded by the gaze of the people they had sought to terrify, the legend of the Daltons was executed as surely as the men themselves. When the smoke cleared, Coffeyville was no longer just another town on the map of Kansas. It had become the graveyard of the Dalton Gang's legend. The dust that hung over the square drifted slowly down onto still bodies and shattered glass, onto pools of blood that darkened the dirt, onto the faces of men who had once been whispered about as untouchable. The people of Coffeyville had not only defended their banks, they had carved their names into the story of the American West. The bodies of Bob, Grat, Dick Broadwell, and Bill Power were dragged from the square and placed in a row for the townsfolk to see. Their dusters were torn, their boots caked in mud, their guns lying beside them like relics of arrogance. The air was heavy with the silence of finality, broken only by murmurs and the occasional sob of a woman who had watched too much death in one morning. Men who had pulled the triggers stood nearby, rifles in hand, their faces grim. There was no joy in their victory, only the weary satisfaction of survival. Coffeyville had not celebrated. It had endured. Emmett Dalton lay wounded beyond recognition, riddled with bullets yet clinging stubbornly to life. He was carried into custody, his body soaked in blood, his youth drained away in pain. Doctors tended to him, astonished he had not already slipped into death's arms. For days he hovered between worlds, his breath shallow, his eyes flickering open only to fall shut again. Some said it was loyalty to his brothers that kept him alive. Some said it was guilt, and others whispered that perhaps it was the cruelest punishment of all, to survive and remember. News of the Dalton Gang's fall spread with a speed only tragedy can summon. Telegraph wires buzzed, and by the next day, papers from Kansas City to New York were filled with lurid accounts. Illustrations of the shootout appeared in print, woodcuts showing the Daltons as both monsters and martyrs. Reporters painted Coffeyville as the little town that stood against legend, a place where ordinary citizens had shown the outlaw world that the age of terror was closing. But even in death, myths cling stubbornly. In some saloons, men raised glasses to the Daltons, calling them brave fools who had dared to reach higher than any outlaw before them. The tale of robbing 2 banks in broad daylight, though it ended in ruin, was recited with a strange admiration. To others, they were proof of what greed and arrogance wrought. Parents warned their children that chasing glory could only end in dust. The physical aftermath in Coffeyville was raw and tangible. Windows had to be replaced, bullet holes patched, blood scrubbed from wooden floors. Merchants counted their losses and shook their heads at the audacity of men who thought themselves greater than the law. Yet beneath the practical tasks a shadow lingered, a memory that refused to fade. For years, townsfolk would point to the square, to the banks, to the alley where the Daltons tied their horses and retell the story. Each retelling shifted slightly, but the core remained. Coffeyville stood and the Daltons fell. Emmett's survival complicated the neatness of the tale. Hauled into court, frail and broken, he listened as sentences were read. The jury found him guilty of murder and robbery, and though he had been struck by more than 20 bullets, the law decided his punishment would not be death but decades behind iron bars. He was led away to prison, his body a map of scars, his spirit tethered to the memory of that October morning. In the quiet of his cell, he had time to reflect on the hunger for glory that had led his brothers to the grave. The Daltons' funeral was not a celebration. Their bodies were lowered into the earth with little ceremony, marked as men who had chosen their fate and paid the price. Families wept quietly, but the town itself did not mourn. Instead, Coffeyville hardened. It became a place synonymous with resistance, a town that had looked outlawry in the eye and refused to blink. In the weeks that followed, visitors flocked to Coffeyville, drawn by morbid curiosity. They stood where the gunfight had taken place, bought souvenirs, and asked locals to recount every detail. Coffeyville became a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by the end of the outlaw era. A living museum of the day legend was pierced by reality. The town's identity was forever changed, bound not by its farms or shops, but by the blood that had stained its streets. Yet even as the years passed, the story of the Dalton Gang lingered in strange contradictions. They were villains, yes, but also symbols of defiance in a world growing smaller under the weight of law and order. Their deaths were brutal, yet their names refused to die. And in Emmett's survival, the ghost of the gang lived on, broken, quiet, but not extinguished. The aftermath of Coffeyville was not simply 4 bodies in the dust. It was the death of an illusion, that men could rise above the law through sheer audacity, that the West would forever belong to outlaws. The gunsmoke faded, but the echo remained, whispering that every legend has an end, and that sometimes the end comes not with a marshal's badge, but with the will of ordinary people. When the dust of Coffeyville finally settled into memory, the Dalton Gang belonged less to flesh and blood than to the shifting landscape of myth. Their downfall became a line drawn in the sand, marking the twilight of the outlaw age. Once the West had been a stage where men could carve their names in fire, their pistols the instruments of destiny, their daring the measure of their worth. But the death of the Daltons revealed something starker. The age of the lone gunman was dying, swallowed by communities unwilling to be shadows in someone else's legend. The legacy of the Dalton Gang is not one of triumph but of warning. Bob Dalton had dreamed of surpassing Jesse James, of etching the family name into the same pantheon of outlaw immortality. He believed that the spectacle of robbing 2 banks in a single morning would make history bow before him. In a sense, he was right. History did not forget. But what it remembered was not the glory of his ambition. It remembered the futility of it, the way arrogance can make men blind, and how the soil of Coffeyville absorbed their blood as easily as it had absorbed the blood of farmers and laborers before them. For the people of the West, the Dalton Gang's demise was a parable. Parents told their children of the day ordinary shopkeepers and farmers brought down legends. The lesson was simple but profound. No man, no matter how feared, was untouchable. Justice might not always come from the badge, but it would come from the people themselves when the line had been crossed too far. Coffeyville had shown that legends could bleed, and in doing so, it stripped outlawry of its invincibility. Emmett Dalton's survival gave the tale a strange aftertaste. He lived on to tell his story, his words painting his brothers in shades of defiance and daring. His memoirs gave the Daltons a voice beyond the grave, but they could not erase the truth written into the stones of Coffeyville's square. Readers might have felt sympathy for the last Dalton, scarred and broken. But sympathy is not redemption. His breath was proof not of victory but of endurance, the endurance of memory, the endurance of consequence. Over time, the Dalton Gang became less a story of individuals and more a symbol of transition. Their fall marked the passing of the old frontier into something less wild, less forgiving of rebellion cloaked in bravado. The trains they robbed would soon be guarded by greater law. The towns they once terrorized would grow into cities. The West was no longer a place where legend could be forged by pistol fire alone. It was becoming a place where law and community, however imperfect, tightened their grip. The Daltons had tested the limits of the old world, and the old world had broken them. And yet, like all figures who meet their end in violence, the Daltons linger in the imagination. Their names echo in the songs of balladeers, in dime novels that bent truth into entertainment, in films that cast them as tragic anti-heroes. There is a strange romance to failure, to men who reached for immortality and grasped only dust. In this way, the Daltons achieved something after all, not the glory Bob dreamed of, but the permanence of cautionary myth. Coffeyville itself wears the memory like a scar, one it never tried to hide. Visitors still come to stand where the outlaws fell, to breathe the air of a place that once defied legend. The town does not boast, nor does it weep. It remembers, because in that remembrance lies its own form of power, the knowledge that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than courage and conviction, can change the course of history. The Dalton Gang's story ends not with their deaths alone, but with what those deaths revealed. Glory is fragile, legends are brittle, and when men mistake fear for immortality, they discover that the earth is always waiting to reclaim them. The bodies were buried long ago, the guns have rusted, the dust of the square swept clean by time. But the echo of that morning has never faded. The crack of rifles, the cries of horses, the silence after. It all lingers, a reminder carved into the marrow of the West. This was not justice, this was memory weaponized. The Daltons are gone, but their fall remains, a story that refuses to die, a warning that still whispers across the plains. No legend is safe from the truth.